Hello everyone, welcome to IS 300 and today's discussion of Public Cloud Service Agreements, what to expect and what to negotiate. This week's reading assignment is based on a white paper written by the Cloud Standards Customer Council. In this week's discussion, we'll talk about the anatomy of a cloud service agreement, including 4 artifacts: the customer agreement, acceptable use policies, cloud service level agreements, and privacy policies. The customer agreement provides a definition of the roles, responsibilities, and execution of processes that need to be formally agreed upon. These customer agreements are typically legally binding documents. In fact, all of these artifacts are legally binding agreements. This one in particular defines what the cloud service provider does and what the customer does. Acceptable use policies describe the set of rules to be followed by the customer, by the users. It identifies the guidelines that must be used when accessing resources, networks, websites, and/or services. Cloud Service Level Agreements, or SLAs, are formal documents, again, legally binding formal documents agreed upon by both parties, which define service level objectives for availability, performance, security, and compliance and/or privacy. The privacy policies are agreements that highlight commitments to maintaining the privacy and the protection of all collected data. So in this week's discussion, there are things that can be negotiated and things that should be considered standard in a cloud service agreement. There are 10 things that can be negotiated, and we're going to cover those briefly here. Number 1 is understanding roles and responsibilities. Who does what? What does the consumer do? What does the provider do? What does the customer do? What does the provider do? Acceptable use policies that must be reviewed by the customer so they know what their responsibilities are and what are the responsibilities of the provider. Look at the business level policies. The business level concerns typically where is the data stored? How is it stored? How is it disposed of? Is it protected? Is it backed up? How can it be recovered in the case of an emergency? Is there any change notification and/or change management to the services, the APIs, the application programming interfaces, and/or the agreements? How or why can services be suspended? What is the liability? And any explanation and/or definition about who owns the intellectual property. Understanding the service and deployment models. There are 3 service models, and these 3 models should be very familiar to you by now. We've been talking about them all semester. Infrastructure as a service, which is basic IT infrastructure resources. Platform as a service, which includes the applications, data storage, and the platform, hardware and software, on which those applications and data storage is housed. Software as a service is simply the application itself. Then you also have 4 deployment models. Private clouds, which is commonly something between a vendor and a customer, usually exclusively for the use of that vendor and customer. Community clouds, public clouds, which is what this particular white paper is focused on, public clouds, and/or hybrid clouds, which is a combination of both. Number 4, critical performance objectives. There should be specific service level objectives that should be met by the cloud provider. Those can be negotiated, but they should be well defined. And of course, security policies. What measures are applied to determine if the security has been met, if the provider offered or has any certifications or any of their employees hold certifications that can be useful for cloud, for the services they offer, then those should be included in the agreement. Privacy, that simply says, here's what the customer, here's what we tell the customer, rather, that they will be able to collect in order to provide and support the services of the customer, and what rights does the provider have with the expectation of the use of data. Do they get access to the data? Do they even see the data? Those types of things. Data residency. Where does the data reside? What happens if the data is relocated? And what happens when the data moves from one jurisdiction or from one geographic location to another? This is particularly important if you're moving between states, or even more definitely if you're moving between countries. If it's an international company and you're moving your location overseas, then how does that in fact impact the requirements and the issues, legal issues that might be different in the location where you're relocating to? Service management. Provisioning. How and who does the provisioning? Auditing if it becomes necessary. Account setup and onboarding, that usually involves setting up permissions, authentication, and those kinds of things. Enabling the services and or disabling the services. Reporting and monitoring. Metering, simply for billing purposes mostly. And the support and maintenance, usually the provider responsible for both support and maintenance. The preparation for service failure management. You have to plan for the event of a failure. So event management, event logs, and who's tracking the events as they occur, who's receiving the alerts if there is an event. Incident management, which includes trouble ticketing, things like that, and problem management in the case of a security breach or something of that nature. Then the metrics, which should be collected. The metrics then give you a baseline to determine if the service level objectives as defined in the agreement are actually being met. So the metrics are important. Mean time between failure. How long of an interval is acceptable for the amount of time before a failure occurs? How long does it take, if there is a failure, for the system to come back up? And the amount of time between the recovery and the next failure. So simply keeping track of how long it takes, how long between downtimes, how long it takes to come back up, and how much time between when you come back up and the next failure. Those are the things that can be fairly easily collected and can be described and defined in a service level agreement. Then there's a disaster recovery plan. The resumption of any applications, any data, hardware, network, or other IT infrastructure in the case of a man-made or natural disaster. What happens when a disaster occurs? What are the processes for getting the services back up and running in the event of a disaster? One of the things that's pointed out in the white paper is that even when outsourcing to a cloud provider, that doesn't absolve the customer of the need to have a serious disaster plan. Usually, that plan should be uh, defined in agreement with the provider and the customer. Effective governance, any problems that arise with public cloud usage should be defined and the expectations should be set so that if there is an issue with the management of the services, that is defined in the service level agreement. What happens when there is an issue with change management and or incident management. And finally, the exit process. How do you get out of the cloud service level agreement? Well, you can do it voluntarily. So if, let's say, the business moves or the business is no longer going to be in operation, or there's a merger with another company and you no longer need the cloud service level agreement, then there should be a way for termination for what they call convenience. Customer can stop using cloud services as long as it is defined in the service level agreement and as long as they give the appropriate amount of notice, usually 30 days. And provider can also do the same thing as long as adequate notice is provided to the customer in advance. If the customer decides to terminate the agreement, there may be a penalty if that's written into the service agreement. That's something that should be negotiated up front. Now, termination for cause is a whole nother ballgame because if there's a default, a breach, or some kind of issue that causes damages or loss of data or something like that, then the party that's responsible for the breach should be expected legally to fix that breach to make the other party whole, usually within 30 days, hopefully without the need for litigation. But if there is a need for litigation, then that should also be specified in the service level agreement. Again, it is a legally binding document which defines the expectations for both the provider and the customer. If you have any questions about this week's discussion, please let me know.